So my name is Stefan Gustavsson. I work for Apologia, an apologetic ministry in Sweden, and I'm also part of the European Leadership Steering Committee, and I've been part of ELF from the beginning. It has been such a blessing in my own life and in my own ministry, and I hope that ELF will be such a blessing also for you in your ministry. We will have a very easy structure here. I will give a presentation, and as usual, I will use PowerPoint. The cultural temperature is really rising in new issues, a number of new issues like Black Lives Matter and identity politics provoke heated debates all over the Western world and maybe globally. And it creates new lines of conflicts. And we, if we are evangelists, church planters, apologists, we need to learn how to deal with these new challenges and deal with them in wisdom and in grace. So we have a challenging hour in front of us, talking about some issues that are not that clear-cut as some other issues we often talk about. So we need a lot of wisdom and a lot of help here. Identity politics is a term that describes a political approach wherein people of a particular religion or race or social background or class or some other identifying factor form exclusive alliances. So you rally around specific identities. And that is, in one sense, it's not new. You can think of many times in history where people have rallied around a specific identity, ethnic or social. But it comes to us in a new form and in a much greater variety. And from identity politics follows a whole series of new words, a terminology that is totally bewildering, of queer theory and critical race studies and post-colonial studies and gender studies and intersectionality and cancel culture and Black Lives Matter and woke, and you can continue. New terminologies to be learned. How do we handle all this? How can we understand it? How can we relate to it in relationship to our Christian faith and to the biblical message? The problem here is not only that we have a huge number of new terms and terminologies. It is that they are put into a very heated climate. It's important to see that even though none of these terms that you see on the screen are in the Bible, and some of them are quite fancy and new terminology, there is a clear relationship between those terms and the biblical message. Because people who use those terms, behind them, they see oppression. They have a longing for justice. They want liberation. They strive for freedom. So all these new terms are related to big biblical themes. And I think it's important for us to see that relationship. The problems to discuss them is that they are put into a cultural moment which is so filled with emotion and strong commitment and activism and polarization and accusations in different directions and so much of anger. So it's hard to discuss those themes today in a constructive way. And still we have to learn to do that. I suggest that when we approach those issues and all those terms, and I will go into some of the meaning of them, I think it's helpful for us to think in 3 steps. As followers of Christ, how should we relate to this trend? I think we, instead of reacting to what we hear, first of all need to think through our own attitude. And then I think we need to really listen to try to understand these new trends and perspectives. And then thirdly, we need to relate it to the gospel and to the biblical faith. But I think it's a healthy thing to start with our own attitude. What is the attitude I should have towards myself? Well, as a Christian, I'm deeply aware of how sin has corrupted human beings, and I'm included in that category. And I know as a Christian how prone to self-deception and blindness we as human beings are. Therefore, it's really important to be open to self-examination, because we know that we are corrupted and that we are so easily blinded. So, if this is the case, we should not only react and criticize or defend in relationship to what's going on now, but we need to also to have some self-assessment, to listen and learn, especially if we belong to a privileged group that are attacked and criticized today. So, for example, being a white, male, heterosexual, Protestant, middle-aged man, a lot of people would place me high up in a hierarchy and say you are privileged. Instead of just react to the description and the criticism that follows with that description, that as a privileged person, I am part of an oppression of those who are under me, because that is what is said. I think we need to listen and we need to learn. And we need to take seriously a discussion about privilege and about oppression, and be aware of how easy it is to be self-righteous or go into a mode of self-defense. In terms of listening and learning, it can help us to listen and learn in 3 stages. How is the problem identified? The identification. These new trends, how do they define the problem we are faced with? Secondly, how do they diagnose the cause of this problem? What do they give as a cause, as a reason for us having this problem? And thirdly, what do they propose as a solution? What's the cure? And in this process of identification, diagnosis, solution, what's the problem, what's the cause, what's the cure, to think, do I agree? Would I like to agree but add something? Or do I disagree and have another identification of the problem or the cause or the cure? And here it's not always black and white. Things are often more complicated. Okay, so I think we should move into the discussion with this kind of attitude, being open to self-examination and open to learn some new things. Secondly, we need an understanding what on earth is going on in our culture. What kind of trends and movements is this that we have around us now? I think the easiest way to understand it is to say that what we see now is a very surprising moment in time, where we see the merge of two movements, that is Marxism and postmodernism, together forming a new climate. This is surprising. After the Berlin Wall came down and the collapse of the Soviet Union, most of us thought that Marxism was going to die. It belonged to the past because it's failed so miserably. But that is not true. Well, it's true, it's failed, but the surprise is that there has been a comeback of a sort of Marxist thinking, and it has married itself to postmodernism. And now together, those two streams merge and they fight. Let me explain how this works. In order to understand this, we need to look at the number of significant individuals that can help us understand what's happening. Individuals whose ideas are behind what we see around us today. So let me introduce you to these 6 persons. Some of them you recognize immediately. Some of them may be new faces. So we begin with this familiar face, Karl Marx. So here we have the founder of Marxism. In his understanding, the most important aspect of society is the conflict between the capitalist, the bourgeoisie, who own the means of production, and on the other hand, the proletariat, the workers, the working class. And they are in conflict. The capitalist oppresses the proletariat. And that can only be changed through a violent revolution. So you have this conflict, 2 groups, and the only way to change this is through a violent revolution. Now, there was a violent revolution in Russia, but things did not go that way in Western Europe. And then a Marxist philosopher, Antonio Gramsci, who was imprisoned in Italy, and he wrote some notebooks that was published after his death, where he was analyzing the situation. And Gramsci realized there will never be this violent revolution in the West. The bourgeoisie, in Gramsci's view, has developed a hegemonic culture using ideology rather than violence or economic force to suppress people. So, in his view, we are in a new situation where it's ideology that keeps people imprisoned. And we need to realize that we are in a situation in Western society where there is produced values and norms that becomes the common sense of everyone, maintaining the status quo. So the oppressed groups, the workers, do not see the need for a violent revolution. And this cultural hegemonic, this unified norms and perspectives are produced through the institutions. So this was an important step, changing Marxist thinking. The third person is Herbert Marcuse, the Frankfurt School, who's often called the father of the new left. So it's It's belonging to the Marxist side, the left side. And he was a very well recognized academic, but an activist academic who used his academic position as an activist. Angela Davis have said, Herbert Marcuse taught me that it was possible to be an academic and an activist, a political activist, a scholar and a revolutionary. He continues in the same vein as Gramsci. He has a critique of the capitalist society, and he looks at the modern affluent society that it represses people, it imprisons people, even those who are relatively economically successful within it. The revolution will come not through the working class, who are bound by the hegemonic culture, you can say, but through a mixture of the intellectual, the academic activist, and the outsiders, those not yet integrated into the cultural hegemonic. They together can change society. The fourth person is not that well known, but a very well-known phrase is ascribed to him. And that is a German sociologist and journalist, Rudi Dutschke. He is the one who's coined, or is said to have coined, the phrase, the long march through the institutions. If Gramsci and Marcuse is right, then the key thing is to take control over the institutions that produces the ideas that creates this hegemonic system. And the most important institution is, of course, teaching, pedagogic, media, journalism, and social workers. And we must, according to Dutschke, walk the long march through the institution, take over the institutions, so we, through the institutions, can produce something new and change society. The next person is not even that, is not very well known either, Carol Hanisch, but she is also connected with a very well known phrase, namely the personal is political. She describes in an article how she, together with a number of other women, met together in a kind of small group, cell group, to discuss their lives and to discuss the political situation. And she writes, one of the first things we discover in these groups is that personal problems are political problems. There are no personal solutions at this time. There is only collective action for a collective solution. So people start to look at politics as the savior, not only as a system where you can solve certain economic and legal issues, but you broaden politics to include everything. All your personal dilemmas and problems are to have a political solution. This is very radical, but has in so many ways become part of mainstream culture today. The personal is political. And the last person, and she is more well known as a scholar, Kimberly Crenshaw. She's the one who has coined the word intersectionality. With that, she means that a person brings with him or her a number of identities, and they can intersect. So a person's social and political identities, gender, caste, sex, race, class, sexuality, religion, disability, physical appearance, height, etc., combine to create different modes of discrimination and privilege. So you have a hierarchy of oppression and privileges. And she would say very very low down in the hierarchy, very much oppressed, would be a black, disabled, lesbian woman, for example, a Muslim woman in the Western world. So we all bring with us many different identities. And so we have this hierarchy of oppression and privilege. And then, of course, some people are at the top, feeding off all the other layers and leading the oppression. And part of intersectionality is that these things can only be really understood from lived experience. So I cannot speak for something that I have not experienced myself. So it's only the person who themselves have experienced a certain identity who can speak for that group. Okay, here we have 6 persons. At the start, there was Marxism. And all through this development, there are 3 perspectives continuing on from Marxism. The first, I would say, is historical necessity, the determinism that was part of Marx's idea that history is moving inevitable to a certain goal. And that idea is still with us. And now it's often formulated in terms of, you are on the wrong side of history. We will end up here anyway. So if you have a different opinion, you are on the wrong side of history. You will be a loser. From Marxism, we have the idea of a group against another group. For him, it was the capitalist versus the proletariat. Now that is extended to race and sex and gender and power and culture, and on it goes. But it's still one group against other groups. And thirdly, the idea of a revolution, that our problems are systemic. It is a system that is integrated into our whole culture, into our whole society, and it cannot be gradually changed. It must be overturned in a radical revolution, in a great shift. So here are 3 ideas that goes all the way back to Marx, and all the other thinkers, they bring them, these 3 ideas with them, I would say. Now, this stream has then married itself to postmodernism. And that is quite an easy marriage, at least on some points, because in postmodernism, you have this analysis of power. And what I've talked about is, of course, an analysis of power and oppression. Postmodernism likes deconstruction of tradition and hierarchy. In postmodernism, you have the importance of language. And we can see in the cultural trend now, what words you use is so important. And of course, in postmodernism, you have subjectivity as the only possible vantage point. So there is no objective description of reality. It must come from the subject. Now, what I've tried to describe here in a very generalistic way is a cultural moment which is deeply troublesome, in my view, because it's deeply incoherent. It lacks rationality. It is trends who goes against oppression, but one oppression seems to be replaced by another oppression. Previously silenced groups are now silencing other groups. We can think of LGBTQ people who have been silenced historically, and now demands that other groups are being silenced. Often intolerance is fought with another set of intolerance. And people talk quite a lot about norm criticism, only to introduce a new set of norms. And they reject objective truth, but simultaneously, all the way through, they are affirming new truths. So it's a problematic movement. There is, of course, so much more to be said about understanding what's going on in our culture. But let me move to a few thoughts on gospel perspective before we open up for a discussion and can process this together. From a Christian point of view, politics is important, because society is important, and government is important, and order instead of chaos is important, and law and justice is important. But politics is not a savior for the Christian, only Jesus is. And a lot of issues should not have political solutions, but should have personal solutions. A number of aspects of human life should we solve together in a family or in a community, but it should not have political solutions. So we would like to make strong distinctions here about the realm of politics, which is an important area, and we need many Christians to go into that area. But we don't want politics to swallow every aspect of human existence. As Christians, we find principles and values and perspectives in the Bible, but we do not find a party program. And I think that's important. I'm worried, I have to say, about the development in the US, where it seems, at least from the outside, as if so many Christians and so many churches are affiliating themselves with either the Republicans or the Democrats in a way that I think is very unhealthy. Of course, if you have a two-party system, you have to choose when you vote, or if you want to engage yourself in politics, you have to choose one of the two big political parties. I fully understand that. But I think it's very dangerous to identify a certain political party with all the mess that's always part of political work, with the Christian faith, with the gospel, or with the Bible. But from the Bible, we have, of course, a worldview, an anthropology, an ethic. We have perspectives that we want to apply in a political work. So don't misunderstand me here. But I think it's really important that we have the right kind of relationship between political activism and political parties on one side and the church. Moving on to the issues we are discussing here, it's obvious and very important to see that the Bible affirms our anger towards oppression and gives us a strong call to fight all forms of injustices. So, as a first step, we are really with all those who want to fight oppression, who want to see justice to be done. That is very important to say. We should be the first to take up that call, to fight oppression and to try to establish justice and righteousness as far as that is possible in a fallen world. But when we take up that call, we of course have to do it from a biblical perspective. And we have our view of sin and salvation, which means that we have often a much deeper and broader analysis of our problems as human beings. It's not one group instead of another group, on the really basic level, it's all of us who are sinners, who are selfish, who are guilty. Then, of course, on a specific issue, it could be an individual instead of another individual, a group of people instead of another group of people. I'm not denying that. But we have a deeper analysis of the problem that puts everyone on one level in the same category as broken people. And then we have to deal with specific situations and try to sort them out. For us, it's not one aspect like power, but sin infiltrates everything. And our basic human problem is not power, even though that can be one aspect of it, that we misuse power. But we see that sin is a poison that poisons everything. Of course, we need to deal with specific sins and oppressions related to political power or economic power or military power. So we cannot ignore the specifics, but we deal with it from a deeper perspective. And we don't see politics as the ultimate solution. We work with politics, but in the light of the hope we have of redemption in Jesus Christ, of regeneration, and of him finally establishing his kingdom on earth. So when I think in terms of a critical evaluation of current trends, I think in terms of some you can say opposites. Is truth objective or subjective? So much of what's going on today is built upon an assumption of truth being subjective. We, of course, think that truth is objective. There is an external reality. There is truth outside, out there. Of course, we approach truth as subjects, as individuals. So there is a subjective dimension, but we can never sacrifice the concept of truth, the concept of a reality that is out there, created by God, and that we all live in that same reality. Language. Should we see language as something that oppresses or as communication? Of course, language can oppress. We can use language in a manipulative way and in a way to oppress. But basically, we should view language as a means of communication. And I'm just horrified by the cultural trends today that makes us so afraid of talking, because you can be sacrificed if you are using the wrong word or saying the wrong things, or instead of searching for, can we communicate with each other? Can we help to understand each other? So as Christians, we have a high view of language because we believe in the word that can communicate. And then, of course, we need to be careful so we don't use our language in an oppressive way. Should we go for reform or revolution? Should we throw down the whole system? The Christian way here is obviously, I would say, the way of reform. Revolutions eat their own kids. It's so much easier to tear down than to build up. And therefore, we should believe and work for a gradual reforming of society. We reject, as Christians, utopianism. So we would work for reform. I think it's a really strange thing that in the most equal and most just and most open society in all of world history, the Western civilization, we hear people shouting, tear down the system. Isn't that strange? Of course, there's a lot of flaws in Western civilization. It's filled with sinful people and therefore filled with sin. And yet, are there any culture in world history that is more equal or more just or more open? So we shouldn't tear down the system. We should improve the civilization that is built. Should we have our emphasis on a unique identity out from ethnicity or gender or sexuality or physical appearance or skin color, or should we have our emphasis on our shared humanity? I think for Christians, the answer is obvious. We should have our emphasis on the fact that we are all created in the image of God, that we are all welcomed into the family of God through faith in Jesus Christ. And then, of course, we need to take seriously our individual identities and what those means. But we will have our emphasis on our shared humanity. What about individual or collective responsibility or group responsibility? Here, I think it's obvious that you have to say yes to both. But the Christian faith has a strong point strongly to the individual responsibility. Each one is going to give an account before God. It's not groups, it's not culture primarily, but individuals. Of course, we also have a group responsibility, a family, a nation, a group. I'm not at all denying that that is a factor of life, that we belong to a group and that group can have mistreated other groups, and we need to take that seriously. So here we need to deal with both aspects. It's not an either or. And the trend today to think mainly in terms of group responsibility, I think is problematic. What about reconciliation or revenge? Since we have a long history before us, there will be a lot of injustices being done. How should we sort that out? Should we go the way of revenge, that an oppressed group should now take out their revenge on their oppressors? Or is there a better way of finding a reconciliation between different groups? Here I think the gospel talks about reconciliation. That is not cheap grace. Of course, we need to take seriously what has happened in history. I'm not denying that. But the way forward is not revenge, but reconciliation. And lastly, freedom or exclusion. Do we want a society where there's freedom for all and where we can live side by side with different opinions, different faiths, different lifestyles? Or should we have a society where we exclude the person who has the wrong opinion, who say the wrong things, who is not politically correct? I think it's very frightening the way the cancel culture is spreading today. We need to go for freedom, not exclusion, and then have open debates about ideas.